Hello and welcome to another installment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Ed Sudoku and Michael Dryden. This week, we take a look at the carbon cost of football, the effects of climate change on the game, and what football is doing to help tackle the crisis. And we discuss whether football is doing enough to lower its carbon footprint. A disclaimer on that one, it actually isn't, but you can listen on to find out how and why. But before we start, please follow us on Twitter at @yfootball_ and subscribe with us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, and YouTube. Dryden, how you doing?
Not bad. That was a very cinematic introduction. Quite liked it for what is quite a dramatic podcast, quite a deep one.
It is a deep one, to be fair. So it's a big switch up from talking about the worst Premier League teams in Didier and Dong. That's for sure.
It very much is, but equally as depressing for me because obviously Sunderland came 3 times in the top 10 for the worst Premier League teams in history. But we'll we'll swiftly move on. I'm not bad. On the topic of Sunderland, I went to Cambridge United away on Saturday. We won, but it was freezing. It was so cold. Um, standing standing stand, if that's the way you refer to it as. So it was a blast of the past and go to an old school stadium. But yeah, it was Baltic, man. It was so cold. We won, thankfully, but the players did not want to be there. We've got guys on loan from, it's a guy on loan from Union Berlin. I think he was just looking around thinking, what am I doing here? But yeah, got 3 points. We've been in a bit of a rut, so it was good to come out of that. But yeah, how are you doing, just?
Yeah, good. I was at the game on Saturday. Watched Arsenal Newcastle, which is good. Good result for us, 2-0. Obviously, you were very happy about that result as well. I've been telling a lot of people at my actual day-to-day job, as I've said multiple times on this podcast, believe it or not, I'm not a full-time podcaster, and I'm not an author, nor am I an actor. Even though
Mm.
that I do give off signals and signs that I may well be. I actually have a normal desk job day to day. And like, on a call, like, I don't know how it came up. Someone was like, oh, like, I think I said, oh, yeah, actually a football podcast. And like, I feel like a lot of people have actually tuned in. And I think depending on the ep, they'll see a very different side to me. Probably the
That's
side,
true.
probably the side that you've seen when Arsenal go 2-0 down away at Brighton. Um, which isn't really which isn't really a side anyone wants to be around.
Mm.
But apart from that, weekend was good. Went out with a few of my friends on the weekend, which was enjoyable. Sunday, I watched I watched the Super Sunday games, Brentford, Everton, and Man United, Chelsea. I actually started mouthing off right at Burnley, Tottenham because I said, Burnley, Premier League club. How come they don't have undersoil heating? Because obviously the game got called off. I was like, absolutely ridiculous. They don't spend money on players, really. How can they not afford undersoil heating as a Premier League club? Because hello, these clubs make so much money. Apparently, the snow was that mad. The undersoil heating has been on all week, but it's just that the snow was so heavy so quickly that it didn't really matter how hot the pitch was. The snow was just settling. Um,
Yeah, I saw some people tweet about this as well. I think it was Duncan Alexander. He might have been taking the mick, but basically saying that, well, undersoil heating is meant to kind of thaw frozen ground, not melt snow. I suppose it could do both, but if you melt snow rapidly as it's coming down, it's going to end up with a waterlogged pitch, aren't you? So, oh, unless they've got drainage, who knows? Maybe we'll do an episode with the groundsman. That'd be quite interesting, wouldn't
Yeah,
it?
it wouldn't be too bad, mate. My old flatmate actually at uni, his cousin was a groundsman at Arsenal.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, funnily enough, I put a disclaimer. This is Why Football exclusive. He said that Cesc Fabregas was refusing to come to training, which is why he left. He was on strike. That's insider knowledge, mate. So to all of you out there, you thought Why Football exclusives, you have to listen in weekly. But
I thought you were going to tell me that he left because he wasn't in favor of the undersoil heating at the training ground or something. But
I'm not playing with that undersoil heating. No, I think Cesc Fabregas leaving was a lot deeper than that. But you never know. Undersoil heating may have been involved. But moving on to the topic of climate change, which is a very deep topic indeed.
Hmm.
Why did you decide to look into this episode?
Well, as we've seen, I mean, the fallout from COP26 has been fairly recent. Obviously, the conference in Glasgow that all the world leaders got together. We saw Boris Johnson falling asleep, which was amusing, but also quite sad. And yeah, the world is slowly waking up to the effects of climate change as being one of the most talked about topics in recent weeks. There's a kind of one of the fallouts from COP26 is a plea generally to keep global temperatures global temperature increase, should I say, at below 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, that could lead to severe and irreversible consequences. Weather events will become the norm, and parts of the world will eventually vanish underwater, which is not good at all for many reasons. But it's obviously that's terrible in any case. But also, it has effects on football. Obviously, it'll affect everyone, but football clubs around the world will be affected by these consequences. But football isn't just a victim, but a major contributor in terms of carbon emissions. Um, and now that generally is becoming widely accepted in society that change needs to happen, we're starting to see, even things like vegan related food being advertised, and the old marketing campaigns kind of centering around climate change, which is good because it's kind of showing that consumer behavior is changing in that regard in certain industries. But even football is now finally responding. It might be responding because it has to, because of pressure, which we'll come on to. But either way, it's still at least sending messages out that it wants to change and promote the cause. Brentford recently announced they will be retaining their same kit, so the kit they have this year for next season. One of the reasons for that is climate change. Another one is to apparently save their fans money. Which, to be fair, I don't think it's a bad initiative because realistically, you don't need to have a new kit every year. But fans do like having new kits. Other clubs such as Forest Green Rovers and Mines, they've been taking efforts for a number of years to reduce their carbon footprints, and so they should be applauded for that. But it looks as if realistically the rest of the game needs to follow suit. So this episode really is looking at the carbon cost of football in its current form, the effects of climate change and what they will have on the game, and I look at what, if any, are the world's major competitions doing to help tackle the crisis.
Yeah, I think it's good. It's good on Brentford for doing it because look, Sunderland, Celtic, Liverpool, like Real Madrid. What are you changing to your home kits? They're hardly changing. Like Barcelona, oh, we got rid of the hoops for like the side patterns, and Real Madrid is like, oh, we're wearing white with white again. It's the same thing, like, and it's just it's annoying that,
Mm.
and you'll see this a lot during this episode because it's something I'm fairly passionate about, quite passionate about, I'd say, is that like it's always the smaller clubs that are pioneers in these sorts of things, and there's always, but the real issues are the huge clubs, the Barca's, the Real Madrids, the Bayern Munich's, the Man
Mm.
United's, the Chelsea's, and they're not doing enough. Like, you're getting all sorts of gear, 3 kits, different home kits. I think Napoli have another special kit to commemorate Maradona.
Maradona,
Then
yeah.
all of the training tops, there's a home training tops, away training tops, Europe training tops. Like, it's just what match day gear, towels, also, and it's just too much. And I think a lot of these big clubs, they pat themselves in the backs. I think Sky Ocean Rescue teamed up because with the football team because they managed to produce what's it called, like recyclable shirts for like one game, and then everyone's oh yeah, we've done like really really good stuff, but it needs to be
Mm.
more than that. So I'm happy to see that Brentford are doing that, but it's manufacturers as well, and yeah, we'll come on to that a little bit later, but yeah, I would be shocked if another Premier League side followed Brentford's suit. That's what I'm saying at the moment.
Yeah, no, you are not wrong. So, moving on to kind of for the first section of this, which is football, basically the carbon emitter and its past. We're really asking a question here: does football care about its carbon footprint, and is it going to be doing enough to tackle that? So, think about that first question. Historically, no. Football has not cared about its carbon footprint, but realistically, nor has the world. The world as a whole has slept on this issue. I don't think we could lambast football for being exclusively, irresponsible in terms of its carbon emissions, even though it has been. A lot of other industries have done that. A lot of other industries have been a lot worse in terms of waste, and certainly have checkered pasts in that regard. Um, we'll talk shortly about what football is trying to do to reduce its carbon footprint, but the game is still trying to expand. And I mean, we look at all these initiatives. You talked about one before, and we'll go on to it. But the game is still trying to expand, and the bodies that run the world's major competitions are still trying to get richer. So if we think about FIFA and their competitions, the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa produced 2.7 million tons of carbon. 2014 World Cup in Brazil produced 2.16 million tons, and the 2018 World Cup in Russia produced 2.18 million tons of carbon, which is, I mean, it's hard with these sort of things to have a frame of reference. Is that a lot? I don't know. It sounds a lot, and well, it probably is.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where I've started to throw in some figures
Mm.
to kind of get some context as to how much that is. So, roughly 1 million tons of carbon is flying from London to Cape Town 376,000 times, or charging
Wow.
320, or charging 321 billion smartphones, or producing 4.4 million laptops. It's always hard to put context into it because one of the other facts I read was 1 million meat eaters going vegan for a year, but it's just so hard to like contextualize that. But
Mm.
I think flying from London to Cape Town, which is a long flight, that constantly, and because don't forget these World Cups are they not 2 weeks, so it's like all of that carbon dioxide emitted in such a short period of time is
Very
not
harmful,
not
yeah.
not not brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to love those statistics. To be fair, absolutely love a good reference like that. And because yeah, but that's the thing. It's hard when people throw these numbers around. You don't really know, what does 1 ton versus 1 million ton actually mean for the environment, and in terms of the damage. Also, what does it actually take to offset that? And we'll talk about that later on in terms of the offsetting point, but or how skewed offsetting can be as a rhetoric from organisations like FIFA. But again, how do you quantify that? If you're supporting a tournament that produces roughly 1 million on average tons, 1 million tons of carbon on average. What does that really mean in terms of offsetting? What's it going to take to get that back out the atmosphere? It's so hard. And think so, 3/4 of the amount on average for each of those World Cups is supporters traveling to games. So is your fans traveling by plane to Cape Town or wherever to visit the country that's hosting and to watch the games. And so that is such a significant amount. Moving on to UEFA. So again, UEFA have signed up to the UN resolution, which we'll come on to talk about, but are still expanding their competitions and doing so aggressively. So the Europa Conference League kicked off this season. Bad timing, I would say, from the climate point of view, and has increased the number of group matches in UEFA club competitions overall to 288, a 20% rise. That's despite the Europa League group stage being reduced from 48 teams to 32. We've got the expansion of the Champions League, which is going to be effective from the 2024-25 season, which will mean 180 group games, up from 96, which is an 87.5% increase. In the period between 2020 and 21 season and the 2024-25 season, a bit of a mouthful there will be a 55% increase in the total number of group matches in major European club competitions, which means more games, more people traveling. All these fixtures include plane travel. If it's not just the team, it's the fans as well. So when we're talking about the kind of expansion of European competition, we really are talking um, some of the more harmful of expansions. If the Premier League was to double its size, it possibly wouldn't be as detrimental. So there's interesting BBC article actually on the Europa Conference League that I referenced. So in the Europa Conference League, 85% of group games are between teams at least 1,000 kilometers apart, which is mad.
Yeah, that is mad.
It's truly mad. The average distance traveled per team in the group stage is 5,578 kilometers. That is almost identical to flying from London to New York. Across the entire group stage, that would give each person traveling an average footprint of 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per person. 19 teams have to travel more than 5,000 kilometers in total for their group games. 42 games involve trips of 2,000 kilometers or more. 11 teams have to travel more than 1,500 kilometers for each of their away games. Again, all these things hard to put into context if you're just listening to that in referencing points, um, but all significant trips. And we had two English teams playing in Baku a number of years ago, Arsenal and Chelsea. We had two English teams playing in Porto. They were due to play elsewhere, and there was calls that bring them back to play in London, but they didn't. And so we had this unnecessary travel. It just seems that we're just burning carbon for the sake of playing football matches.
The problem with football is this: football wants to increase its global reach. Football wants to increase where it's being viewed all around the world, but it can't coexist with climate change. Like I do understand having finals in Baku. As an Arsenal fan, it wasn't ideal for me to go there. I didn't go there in the end, but I understand that there is a
Mm,
Western hold on football. It shouldn't always be the case that we have all of the finals and all the big tournaments in England, Italy, Spain, places like Romania, Russia, other places in Europe as well, further east, and even places like Baku do deserve, and Tbilisi in
mm,
Georgia, they do deserve to see these tournaments. I think the second point, which is a problem, is the reason why they can't coexist is we want football to be further reaching, which means more CO2 emissions. We want more games, or at least FIFA thinks so. So there's more, there's the Nations League, the World Cup is expanding, the Europa League conference has come in, there's more tournaments, more football, and you can't you can't suddenly make everyone walk to the event. Like, it's not gonna work,
mm.
so emissions have to increase. So
Yeah.
when you're saying, "Oh, we're gonna try and tackle this, we're gonna try and tackle that," it's impossible because you're seeking to increase the competition. So therefore, are they it's impossible basically. And I think football as a whole, as a sport leader, kinda has to do more and try and tackle it in that sense, but I don't see how, because all of their plans are just to saying, "Okay, we're gonna make it even bigger than it was before." The global warming stuff can take a back seat for the time being.
And, football plays a massive role in it. Some people would argue against this, but a massive role in kind of being role models for people in terms of they look up to footballers, they look up to football clubs, they follow their clubs. If they could see the effects on their club long term in terms of their club might be underwater or they might be affected significantly by climate change, they might act differently. So the messaging can be really powerful around that in terms of using that platform that football already has to send a powerful message, not the opposite of we're going to increase our games. What we need is less consumerism in this crisis, not more, and that's what football is doing. So UEFA's website states that it places a special emphasis on promoting climate action within the scope of its competitions. But as we just said, that seems like nonsense. It has faced criticism for the Europa Conference League going ahead and even hosting the Euros across multiple nations this summer. Um, Obviously, these are decided years prior, and you could argue that the kind of interest around climate change has intensified. So, should be looking at their decisions now, not in the past. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. Like, as you've said, the world isn't going to stop for us. So, um, it's crazy. So, there's also a very powerful Tifo football video. Don't always go about advertising other media publications in the podcast, but this is a really powerful video that I implore people to watch. But they talked about a study done by Fluminense in 2014. Fluminense calculated that their club emits 2,500 tons per year of carbon emissions. That includes spectator travel. Tifo kind of on the back of a fag packet rough maths, but they adjusted the average for the Premier League based on kind of a rich Western country that they have higher CO2 and higher waste on average. Pay the Premier League, so when they adjusted it for Premier League attracts more spectators. So based on all those things chucked into the melting pot, they calculated that the Premier League emits roughly 200,000 tons of CO2 per year.
Yeah, I don't know about some of those claims that Tifa have made because the estimate for the Premier League, I think, is too low. For example, the thing with all of these, right, is you don't know the calculations that go in, the assumptions that are made. But Fluminense are a team in Brazil, and as a result, their fans. Brazil is a very big country, but they're
Mm.
nowhere near as international as a Premier League side. So I would love to know the calculations as to how they've actually done it because you've got fans for every big team, and I think it's trickling down even more that are traveling miles, as in across countries. We saw the people that are coming from New York to watch Tottenham against Burnley. I don't.
Yeah.
How are you calculating the emissions cost? I know Brazil is huge. So, for example, Brazil is probably 15 times the size of England, maybe more. But how far is the average fan actually traveling? But then, when the Premier League being so global, I'm not so sure in those figures. Um, then it's obviously the emissions that, the cars would be different here to in Brazil as well. I don't know about coach travel. To be fair, we do have the tube, which is more economically friendly. So, yeah, I'm not,
Mm.
I'm not sure on that one from Tifo because the number does look quite low, but it's still overall it's very high. I think because the numbers I'm seeing with climate change are so high overall that sticks to me as quite a low number, even though 200,000 is actually mad in itself. But yeah, you know what Tifo normally are on the money, so maybe I'll speak
Mm.
to Alex Stewart himself and find out.
You might. But yeah, and even the Burnley, the fan that came from America to Burnley, Tottenham, that was then called off. But then even that, like, again, people shouldn't. I'm not saying people should sit in their house with the lights off and just pretend that or just not live their lives. But Carrie Kane came out afterwards and said that he thought it was amazing that they'd done that, and was so saddened for them that the game was called off and was offered like for them to be a guest at their next home game. Why are you championing that though? That's because realistically, that is against what we're all what we're talking about here. And again, it's difficult because that fan shouldn't come to the game.
Yeah, exactly.
It,
It's one of those.
yeah, but in a crisis, arguably they shouldn't. But if they do it once off, it's not a big. It's arguably not a big deal. If that's a substitute for their usual holidays that everyone and they're really economically friendly, it depends on the person, I suppose. But Tifo took the same logic, the kind of rough, kind of their calculations that you mentioned. He factored that into every competition on the planet, using the kind of the different ratios and factoring for each kind of country, and how in comparison to Brazil and in comparison to UK, how wasteful is that country in terms of CO2 and other things. And they kind of roughly suggested that football is emitting around 10 million tons of carbon per year, which would make it the same as Tunisia. It's a little bit of a kind of shock calculation there, or shock tactics from T4, but yeah, it's a pretty damning figure.
Yeah, and I think that hurricane point kind of ties into exactly what I'm going on about. Like, you can't champion global reach with football, and it's a very difficult bridge to cross. And then say we're trying to tackle climate change. Because yeah, who am I to say you can't come from Bangkok to watch Tottenham play? That's your right as a fan. But there
Mm.
has to be a discussion around how do we tackle climate change then. I'm not saying that fans in Bangkok shouldn't come to football at all. I'm just saying that something has to give, right? I don't know whether it's incentives for fans at home, because yeah, if you're doing it once a year, that's fine. What about all of the fans in the UK? We can come on to that a bit later on. But I just think that football was trying to do two things. They're trying to get more money, expand competitions, become bigger, have more reach, but then they're also saying we want to tackle climate change. And I just don't see how both can coexist. I haven't really seen any measures that are saying, oh, we're going to tackle climate change, we're doing X, or fans that come from Bangkok are on flights that offset this, or even if they are doing that because it's on their holidays, with our home fans, we've got all of these initiatives to help tackle climate change and waste and all sorts, but I've not seen any of that, which is part of the problem.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, moving on now to kind of the effects of climate change on football. Again, I referenced the T4 football bid because it is that powerful. But I will kind of canter over this. So, the main and the most direct impact of climate change on football is flooding and loss of land, mostly affecting the UK and potentially other areas of low-lying Europe, such as the Netherlands. I mean, TIFO predict that by 2050, 23 of the current 92 English Football League teams could expect partial or total annual flooding of their stadium. A number of Dutch teams as well. I remember actually, even from being a bit younger, Carlisle's not too far from where I grew up, and I remember when the flooding happened in 2015 at Brunton Park because of Storm Desmond, and yeah, the club was forced out of the stadium, had to pay huge costs, the insurance premiums went up, and then flooded the training ground, then flooded again, and the car park in 2017. Um, so Carlisle, for example, are an extreme example uh, of how an English football club is affected. They would probably suffer. They're in high flood risk areas anyway. They'd probably suffer flooding, within so many years over a period of time, quite frequently. But they're just an example of what their case study is. What will happen to more and more teams over time as more and more parts of the UK, more parts of the world, become susceptible to flooding. And they were forced out the stadium. The ground is practically ruined. I mean, I think one of the clubs that could be affected by partial flooding in Netherlands is Ajax. So you think, okay, the Amsterdam Arena surely is better equipped to deal with it, although probably wasn't built with that in mind. So that's one thing to consider. But you think a big modern stadium would possibly have better defenses or just be more equipped. But it's just Carlisle, just such an example of what the future can hold. And I mean, Hull City and Cardiff City's ground will, according to TIFO, will be entirely underwater by 2050, and Grimsby's ground will sit below the North Sea. I mean, that's just damning statistics. So it's mad. And Also, going away from flooding, we've got the increase in global temperatures will mean that more matches will be played at high temperatures, increasing the risk of like heat cramps, etc., making it quite dangerous to be playing. We had like the Tokyo 2020 Olympics where some events were had to move from the city. I mean, that's a farce, really. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been awarded the games, but the fact you're having to move events across the world or different parts of the region just so they could be just so they could actually be playable is crazy.
Yeah, when we're looking at it from that lens, you're right. You make some really good points, but the focus is often on Western ball, where the money is there to. Obviously, you can't, if the land is underwater, doesn't really matter how much money you have, you
Mm,
can't really raise it. But I often think about the countries, South Asia, which has extremely flat land. I know cricket is a dominant sport there, but people do still play football there, and they're massive football fans.
mm,
They have terrible flooding in Bangladesh and as well as India. Then you focus on Africa, where you've got issues of drought and how that would affect football pitches and how that affect traveling to games. I think even in the Americas as well, South America would struggle with that being on the equator line. I think it's something which will affect a lot more people than we actually think. And
mm,
it's something, where a lot of these countries won't have the money to fix it. And it's also a problem which just ultimately can't really be fixed. If the Amsterdam arena is underwater, I don't really know what they're going to be doing. They're not going to be able to dig it out, are they? So
mm,
it's a real problem which I think needs more focus. But I think it's a very head in the sand case. People think, it can't really happen to Western Europe nations. It can't really happen to England. It can't really happen to, a lot of these countries and teams, which is why the Tifa video is so eye-opening because it kind of showed, if things get a lot worse than they already are, then it could very well end up being some of the biggest clubs that we know on earth.
How is football trying to lower its carbon footprint, if at all? So FIFA are now a signatory of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Sports for Climate Action Framework. Very long-winded there, but it's basically the Sports for Climate Action framework, including the International Olympic Committee have also signed up to that. And basically, the framework is a pledge to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040 and a 50% reduction by 2030. FIFA Council member Isha Johansson gave a keynote speech at COP26, and Gianni Infantino gave a video address, which I just thought was such a sinister thing to do. It's like Doctor Evil on the screen in front of all the delegates. I just thought like you are just like the bad guy, but yeah, he unveils FIFA's climate strategy, which intends to work on a reduction plan to tackle what it calls the three emission hotspots. Travel, logistics, and accommodation. No gold star for that one of determining that. The strategy says it will also FIFA will also review regulations and requirements around FIFA's tournaments and events to ensure best practice in terms of climate change, and has pledged to develop a methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions related to its tournaments and preliminary competitions. Quite wishy-washy statements, to be honest. Michelle Uver, UEFA's Director of Football Social Responsibility, said that UEFA are building their own sustainable event management system with 18 parameters applied to every competition. I tried to Google this, I couldn't really find much about it. Maybe it's still in development. Again, these are all just like long names for big bureaucratic systems that, big long dossiers that look like someone's doing something, but actually when you probably get between the lines, you realize it's actually just too overly complicated for to be applied, or doesn't actually do what it says on the tin. Who knows? Um, so, but I mean, some actions have taken place. UEFA trialled an app at the 2016 Euros, allowing fans to offset their own emissions, but the take up was low. That was just for fans who were travelling to the tournament. Um, and UEFA absorbed the entire carbon offsetting cost for the 2020 Euros themselves in terms of the aviation cost. Um, I'm not too sure if that's just in terms of the aviation cost for the playing teams or is for the aviation cost as a whole based on estimates. Um, but I mean, I'm going to talk a lot on offsetting shortly because it's just a bit of a grey area. The Premier League and the Lawn Tennis Association have said that their comprehensive sustainability strategies will be launched next year. But some clubs, as I mentioned earlier, as you mentioned, just the smaller clubs have taken matters into their own hands. Forest Green Rovers, the first UN certified carbon neutral football club, um, In 2010, Mines became the first club in the world to achieve climate neutrality, which I think means they were the first climate neutral or carbon neutral club, but don't have the UN certification. Is how I kind of understood that difference there. Real Betis have got measures that they have implemented in terms of promoting a greener existence. They call it Forever Green, as they play in white and green. PSG and Juve have signed up to the UN framework I mentioned before. Not that PSG and Juve are ever the good guys in football. And the Bundesliga is aiming to become the first carbon neutral football league. So there's basically murmurings from the footballing world and pledges. We're at the stage where we're pledging, which is probably what was like a COP1, and now we're at COP26. So maybe in 20 years' time, we'll see some real action from football.
I think you could literally have cut out like 2 minutes of what you just said about the FIFA member stuff because it's just all nonsense. Like people just throwing all these buzzwords. Like, for example, what is net zero? What is being carbon neutral? What is your framework? Um, what are the goals you're setting for 2020? How far do you have to go to get there? What are your goals for 2030? How far do you have to get there? Yeah,
Hmm.
stuff. I could say I'm gonna run a 2 minute mile in 2024. How the hell am I gonna get there?
Mm. Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, like, "Oh, yeah, I've got the framework." Yeah? Is the framework actually gonna work? Well, I don't know. It's like, and that's the problem with football is there are a lot of companies that I've looked into that are aiming to be net zero, and the ones which are gonna get there are the ones which have been carbon neutral for, well over a decade. Well over, I looked into
Mm.
Sky for my day job, disclaimer, and they were carbon neutral in 2006. Now they've been making huge progress in terms of cutting down their emissions year on year, and 2030 is feasible for them to become net zero. You can't go 0
Mm.
to 100. With the numbers that football are throwing out there and the lack of care or understanding that seems to be coming from a club level, I just don't see how they're going to be coming down all the way to net zero in 2030. I think 2030 and 2040 are these like buzzwords that everyone's trying to adhere to because of COP26 and because of governments. I think when we get to that year, you'll see a lot of countries scratching their heads and they'll blame some other issue as to why. They'll probably try and blame COVID, to be honest, and say, yeah, because of COVID, we couldn't reach those goals. But it's frustrating because where is the action? Again, Forest Green, clubs like that, Real Betis, Mines, that's when you're seeing physical action. But when I'm hearing we've got framework, it's like, okay, am I going to be hearing the same thing in 10 years' time? So, yeah, I'm not filled with hope with football.
No, I mean FIFA developed this framework of all this rhetoric, but they want to what they want to expand the World Cup, 64 teams. They want to do it every 2 years. They've got what was it the 2026 or the 2030 that's going to be held in the USA, Mexico, and Canada.
Mm,
That's going to be that's going to be like the record carbon emission,
yeah.
carbon emitting World Cup of all time, and yet that's right in the middle of their plans. And the thing is with these statements, and it happens across the board in all industries, is that like something like 2030 and particularly 2040 and in particular 2050 is too far in the future for the people who are currently in charge to be culpable. They know they're not going to be, the people who are making these or starting these initiatives at FIFA, they're not going to be in those positions in 20 years. So for them, it just means nothing. They're not going to be there. So it's just mad. But the actual the investment the investment potential of a World Cup every 2 years in the short term is going to make them loads of money. So they're obviously championing that as well. So yeah. So I mean, to wrap this up, a discussion really is football doing enough? Kind of what can it do? I think if football's doing enough is a difficult question. Well, it's not doing enough, to be honest. But I think one of the key things relating to climate change, what you see with a lot of organisations and a lot of industries, is referring to kind of this idea of carbon offsetting, which is such a grey area. So reducing or having an impact on reducing climate change needs to be about reducing carbon emissions, which means which just sadly for us all does mean reducing consumerism. I know it's not about again sit in your house and turn the lights off, but it means less games. It just means it means less games. It means less events because that means less carbon, not just offsetting. Because offsetting can mean anything. It can mean planting trees. It can mean investing in sustainable projects that are going to take place over the next few years. What happens if those projects fail? You know, a newly planted tree can take as many as 20 years to capture the amount of CO2 that a carbon offset scheme promises. That's a long time. And if that tree, once it dies, is at risk of actually re emitting the carbon that it stores. So it does actually have a good effect. Obviously, in that time it's alive. Without trees on our planet, we'd all be doomed. So not saying we should have more trees and we shouldn't invest in sustainable projects, but I just feel as if football is responding because it feels it has to, rather than actually instilling a promising drastic change. Because even the Premier League is trying to play games abroad. That's not good for the planet, but it doesn't care, and it's got all these projects and offset schemes. But realistically, in the short term, it's not going to be reducing carbon. It's actually increasing. We need to be talking about a reduction, not an increase in events and games. But it generates revenue. So ultimately, revenue comes number top of the priority. Climate change is it number two? I don't even know if it's even number two. But
Nah, probably
even
not.
if it is, it's a distant two. It's like Liverpool being 95 points, top of the Premier League, and number two having 60 points. It's nowhere near.
Yeah, no, I'd say it's probably 10th on the list, knowing the way football's going. But I think
Mm,
football can do so much more. I went to the game on Saturday. There's things around reusable plastics at games. The incentives that clubs are. What are clubs doing to even recycle the stuff that they have? That's very hush hush. A lot of these plastics end up in landfill, which ends up in our oceans. The ocean is the
mm,
biggest absorber of CO2. So when we're talking about global warming and emissions, that's what we need to protect. When these plastics are being damaged or damaging marine life, which helps protect our seagrass and sea moss and
mm,
our coral reefs, this all linked towards football. Too much merchandise ends up as waste. Better economical travel. Why are Arsenal flying 14 minutes to Norwich or Man United 16 minutes to Leicester? New boots. All these players have new boot deals and new F50s and new F40s and new F20s and new F10s and new F120s. Like it's all waste. And for incentives to fans, a lot of these coffee companies, Starbucks and Waitrose, they was it cheaper coffees if you have those reusable cups. Football don't do that. And the thing is, fans are probably quite interested because pints at grounds are expensive.
mm.
They're way too expensive. If someone said, "Oh, £2 off if you have your own, I don't know, Stein or something," then that would help in terms of bringing down the waste and the cost. I think there's so much more that can be done, but often it's a big media campaign and marketing campaign, which is like, hey, I think Spurs had a carbon neutral game. Yeah, that's great, but like,
Mm.
there's a strategy going forward. Like, what is it that you're going to do next? Like, even I can do more, but you're looking towards these big companies to really set the standard, but they don't want to unless they're forced, and they're not really going to be forced because, as you said, two things can't coexist. You can't say we want to increase our global reach. We want to have more fans. We want to have more merchandise. We want to do more tours. We want to do all of this stuff to increase our brand, but then also say, no, 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 but we really want to cut our carbon emissions. I find it very hard to see how both can coexist like that. And, there are people smarter than me involved in these clubs. I haven't seen the framework. I haven't seen the plans to then say, oh, Etches, you know what? We can do all of those things and also bring down our emissions with, better transport and economically friendly merchandise, but I haven't seen any of that whatsoever. I think football is doing very little, so I think the scope for it to do more is very easy, and whether they do that or not waits to be seen.
It's just a sad state of affairs, really. Hopefully, FIFA will get on board. Uefa will get on board with the fact that we just don't need more football games. I guess it's come to the fore more in recent weeks. Even a lot of the sources I use for this podcast, the research, were from studies and articles that only really came out in the last couple of months. I think if we'd done this episode when we started in 2020, I think it would have been a much more challenging thing to run because a lot of these projects, these frameworks, everything that we've just talked about, which are largely wishy-washy and just talking gestures in parts. They didn't exist even in 2020. So that's where it makes me think: are they just responding to pressure because they're suddenly the consumer has become a little bit more concerned about climate change? They need consumers to consume their goods and to buy their products. So they're going to respond. As you said, Spurs, that talking gesture game where there's carbon neutral. Then the rest of the operation is not good for the environment. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. It's quite a long one today, but a very, very important topic that I'm surprised we haven't covered already. But then, as I said, I honestly think if we'd done this in April 2020 when we started, it would have been a much more challenging podcast to put together because I think even back then, the world was still rubbishing claims. Back then, Donald Trump was still saying it was a waste of time, which just is mad. But at least we've got some movement, I suppose. But yeah, thanks all for listening this week. Continue to subscribe with us on all our podcast platforms, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers, guys.